Streaming. Start recording. Good morning. Today's daf is daf Zayin in Menachos. We begin this morning by thanking all of our sponsors. We thank Ashi and Mindy Schreiber for sponsoring all the shiurim of the month of Teves in this. Yo, Rafal Ben Miriam. Also thank Matin Chanalei. The shiurim of the month in memory of his father Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel Ben Kusil Yehuda, whose yahrzeit is in Chavtal Teves. It's also a very big opportunity for us to wish a Mazel Tov. Well, he was here before. To Gabi and Shana Cohn on the engagement of their daughter Rina, to Yisrael Katz. So Mazel Tov to our fellow shir member Gabi Cohn, our Baal Tefillah. What a beautiful simcha! Last night Rina became a kala. Today's daf is daf Zayin. We're going to pick up on daf Vav Amud Beis. We're going to pick up with the word Elotaima Dashmin and Rav. If you remember in yesterday's Mishnah, it listed a number of people who are disqualified from taking the komets. So again, in the mincha, the first process, after putting the mincha into a keli, whoever's bringing a carbon mincha will take all the ingredients of the mincha, he'll put it into a klishares, and then he takes his fingers and he pulls out a kamitza. So he listed a number of people or circumstances that would be a disqualified kometz. If he does it with his left hand, or if he's sitting, or if he's not a kohen, and so on and so forth. Now, the Mishnah mentioned all these people are disqualified. All these circumstances would disqualify it. And Beseira said, after the words of Kamatz B'Smal, that if you do that, you can put it back in and do a redo. In other words, yes, it's a problem to do it that way, but we have an opportunity for a redo. Put it back in and take it out the proper way. Now, Rav went ahead and mentioned that statement from Ben Beseira. We were trying to figure out yesterday what Rav was adding. And the point where we ended off was that he was saying that Ben Beseira is not just saying this about a person who pulls out the kmitza with his left hand. Rather, this is true for all the disqualifying features. Anything that disqualifies the kometz from being done, you could return it back inside the klishares and redo it another time. So now the Gemara says, El Taima Dashmin and Rav. The only reason why we know that Ben Beseira says that, again, this is about 3/4 of the way down the Amud, third word of the line. El Taima Dashmin and Rav. The reason why we know that this is true is because Rav says that. Halav Hachi, if not for the fact that Rav made the statement that Ben Beseira's ruling applies to all the disqualifications, Havi Amina, I would have thought, Beshar Psulim Pasal Ben Beseira. I would have thought that when it comes to all the other disqualifications, Ben Beseira is of the opinion that it's disqualified and there is no opportunity for a redo. How could that be? Tanya, we learned in a brisa, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Omrim, both Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon say very clearly, Machshir Haya Ben Beseira Bekola Psulim Kulan. Ben Beseira gives you the opportunity to redo this carbon, even though the word of the Gemara is machshir, that he says it's kosher. He doesn't mean that it's kosher and we just ignore it. He just means you have the opportunity to go ahead and redo it to make it kosher. Vitanya. In addition, we learned the kamatz misham. There's a brayso that teaches us the word says the kamatz misham. We'll take a kometz from there. There are two different opinions with the words. The first opinion is mimakom sharagli hazar omdos. The Kohen's allowed to take kmitza from a place where even a non-Kohen is allowed to stand. This basically means that, as we learned by many karbanos, the halacha is the shechita has to be done b'tzafon. It has to be done on the northern side of the Beis HaMikdash. This says no, v'kamat misham. You could do the kmitza immediate where the zar stands. We saw this in Zvachim at one point. In other words, a zar, a non-Kohen, comes into the Beis HaMikdash. He hands over his carbon mincha to the Kohen. The pasuk says v'kamatz misham. That teaches you that immediately in that place where the Kohen receives the carbon mincha from the one who's bringing the carbon, he could do the kmitza right then and right there. Now, that obviously is going to be a place where the zar, where the non-Kohen is allowed to stand. So the first opinion is that the kamatz misham teaches you that you do not need to be standing in the tzafon, in the northern part of the Beis HaMikdash. You can do it anywhere. The kivan, sorry, I skipped. The kamatz misham, hold on. Mimaku Shraglas are Omdos. Ben Beseira Omer, Ben Beseira, he says, no, the Kamatz Misham teaches us a different halacha. He says, Minayin Shim Kamatz Bismal. How do we know that if a Kohen takes the kmitza with his left hand, sheyachzir, he should put it back, v'yachzar, v'yikmotz, he should do it again, biyamin, tamalomar v'kamatz misham, the pasuk says it kamatz misham, mimakom shekamatz kvar. In other words, here is where Ben Beseira learns his din. V'kamatz misham says you can go ahead and do a kmitza from the same place that you did it before. In other words, he's not learning from this pasuk that you could do kmitza even in a place where a non-Kohen is allowed to stand. Rather, he says v'kamatz misham, you can pull it out again a second time. Now the Gemara says v'kiva the cross stomach siv, since the pasuk says v'kamatz misham stam. In other words, without any specification, it just says it. Mali small, umali sharp psulin. What logic would there be to say that only when it comes to a left-handed kmitza that there would be an opportunity to redo it again? It should be relevant to any type of disqualification. And therefore, you see very clearly that even without Rav telling us that Ben Beseira's halacha applies to all the disqualifications, we know that Ben Beseira would be of the opinion that any time you take a kmitza in a disqualifying way, all you've got to do is put it back in and redo it again. So again, back to the question, why is it that Rav has to tell us that that's Ben Beseira's opinion? That's clearly what he says, that's clearly what he means, even in his original statement. The Gemara says, Elah Kamash Malan. Must be the Rav was teaching us the following. Elah Kamash Malan Rav. Kamatz, this is true even if he did the kmitza in a disqualifying way. Ba'afilu kidesh, even if he went so far as to put it into another klisharis. Just remember to remind ourselves here, when it comes to carbon mincha, we have the four avodos of the carbon mincha resemble the four avodos of any other carbon. So kmitza is equal to shchita. And then you have, I should say it the other way around. Shchita of a carbon is done with kmitza. Kabbalah sadam in a keli is when you take the kmitza and put it into a keli. Holacha is the same thing as holacha. And zrika is equal to putting the komet on, to burning the komets on the mizbeach. So now, step one is kmitza. Step two is putting it into the klisharis. So now what Rav is telling us here, kamat vafilu kidesh. Even if he takes the kmitza and does the second step of putting it into a klisharis, still, you could still go ahead, redo it, put the whole thing back inside the original klisharis, and start over again from the beginning. Rav is coming to tell us that we do not pass like the following opinions. Which opinions? The Tanya, for it says in the Brisa, Rabbi Yossi, take out the next word, Ben Yossi. Rabbi Yossi ben Yaasyan, Rabbi Yehuda Hanachtom Amru, they both say, Pamedvar Mamurim, when does Ben Beseira say that you can go ahead and redo it? That's shekamat v'lo kidesh, if you took out the kmitza and did not go to the next step of putting it into a klisharis. Aval kidesh, if you took the kmitza and put it into a klisharis, in that case, pasal, it gets stamped as officially disqualified. You've ruined the mincha and you cannot fix it anymore. V'ikad amri, some disagree with that, which is what Rav is saying. Kamatz in kiddush lo. So come on. So who is Rav Paskin? Like Hani Tanai, he's Paskin like these Tanaim. Lafuki Mitanakami, he's coming to say not like the first opinion. In other words, he's of the opinion that even if you put it into the klisharis, it's still going to be able to be returned, put back into the original klisharis, and then done again. That was Rav's point. So again, what was Rav's point? Rav's point was he obviously was not clarifying Ben Beseira's opinion about this redo opportunity being relevant to all disqualifications, because that's clearly Ben Beseira's opinion. What was he saying? He was saying that even if you put it into klisharis, you could still go ahead and redo it. Nask Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman has a technical question over here. He says, Maika Savri Hani Tanai. What is the opinion of these Tanaim that say that once you put it into klisharis, you cannot do it anymore? If they're the opinion that the kmitza of someone who's disqualified is considered, or some kind of disqualifying kmitza, if that's considered an avoda in it of itself, what's the difference if I put into a keli or not? If the kmitza itself is considered to be a full avoda, so you avoda wrong, you've disqualified it. Why do you have to have the second thing there? Now, if the kmitza of a disqualified person is not considered to be a significant action in the process of the carbon mincha, what's the difference if you put into a keli? In other words, the bottom line is, if kmitza is so significant that it ranks as an avoda, why does it connect to the second avoda? Again, remember, shchita, we had a discussion yesterday whether shchita is an avoda or not. But it's isolated in and of itself. Kabbalah Saddam Bekeli is isolated by itself. So why is it that all of a sudden kmitza seems to be tied to the next avoda? If kmitza itself is an avoda in its own right, so then it's an avoda in its own right, and if it was done wrong, the carbon is disqualified. If it's not an avoda in its own right, and it was done wrong, the carbon's not disqualified. What does putting into a keli the second avoda have anything to do with this? Why are you connecting these two things together? They're two separate things. If A is an avoda and B is an avoda, so good. Each one has its ability to disqualify it. If A is not an avoda but B is an avoda, why are you connecting A and B? How are they connected? Amar of Menachos. Rav Nachman says, "La'olam avoda." Of course, kmitza is an avoda. However, v'lo gamra avodasa. At what point have you finished the avoda of kmitza? Ad avid la matan keli. Once you take the kmitza and put it into a keli, then you are finished. So now, if you don't finish properly, so the avoda wasn't done right. So Yihachi asks the Gemara, "Afilu lo kidesh." Even if you're not going to put it into another keli, the Gemara has a very interesting question. Remember, we mentioned when you bring in carbon mincha, what's the first thing you do with your carbon mincha? You take the entire carbon mincha, put it into a klisharis. When you take the kmitza, where are you taking a kmitza from? From the carbon mincha, which already is in the klisharis. So now Ben Beseira says, if you messed up the kmitza, according to those opinions, again, not Rav's opinion, according to those opinions that say that if you take a messed up kmitza and put it into a klisharis, you have officially ruined it. Let's think for a second what happens with Ben Beseira. He says, you took a kmitza with your left hand. It's ruined now. Says Beseira, don't worry about it. Put it right back in to the original keli that it came from. That's a klishares. Who cares if it's klishares A or klishares B? They're both a klishares. So now, according to this opinion, let's think of it. You have a klishares with the whole mincha in it. You take your left hand, take a kmitza out of it. It's still good, it's still good, it's still good. Put it into another klishares, now disqualified, because it went into a klishares. What would Ben Beseira say to do? Take your kmitza, which was done wrong, put it back into the original keli. That's also a klishares. Who cares what the name of the keli is? They're both clay shares. So what's the difference which keli it's from? They look exactly the same. They're identical. One's holding the whole mincha, one is empty. Once you put it back into the original keli, you put it into a klishares, that should disqualify it. Says the Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan says, Zosomeris, this teaches us klisharis e mekachin el midas. A klisharis does not have the ability to be able to sanctify carbon to its next level unless you had in mind to put into klisharis. It must be that according to Ben Beseira, when you're going to put it back into the original keli, even though the original vessel that you're using is a klisharis, I don't have in mind to be mekadesh this kometz inside the original klisharis. I'm just really reversing it, just rewinding the clock. And that's why it's not going to be a problem. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. Hamidas mekachin. Let's just think for a second. Would it become kadosh even if you had in mind? Rabbi Yochanan asked Rish Lakish asked a question from Rabbi Yochanan as follows. Klishares Mahu shiikachu besulim lechatchila likarev. A klishares. What's the halacha? If you take something which was disqualified, you put it into a klishares. Now, are you allowed to go ahead and take that disqualified thing and put it onto the mizbeach? What was his answer? Amar le emikacha. No, it doesn't work that way. If you have something which is disqualified, just the mere fact that you put it into a klishares does not give it the opportunity to not be brought onto the Mizbeach. So why are you telling me that if you have something disqualified like a wrongly done kmitza, if you put it into Klisharis, it becomes sanctified? It doesn't. Rabbi Yochanan said it doesn't. Amar Lei said, no, you misunderstood Rabbi Yochanan. Ein mikachin likarev. He was telling you it doesn't allow it to be now brought onto the Mizbeach. Aval mikachin lipasol. It gives it the ability to officially stamp it as disqualified. So there's different features of a klisharis. One of them is that it's essentially a matir. It essentially permits it to go onto the mizbeach. However, that's only true if nothing's wrong with it. But if something's wrong with it, now the other feature of klisharis comes about, which is you put it into a klisharis, it officially now gets the stamp of disqualified, and that a klisharis can do. So again, in the opinion that Ben Beseira only allows a person to redo the komets, if it was not placed into a klishares, we're trying to figure out how it works when you put it back into the original klishares. The first answer we just gave was that since you did not have intention to put into a klishares for the sake of sanctifying it, so it doesn't work, and therefore you could redo it. Rav Amram Amar, Rambam says, I have another answer to that question. Kegon shechziro lebisa kedusha. What he did over here was he returned it to a keli. Rashi says bisa is the name of the keli. Look at Rashi, bisa klisharis bol in mincha. That's the keli that was used to mix the mincha. So says Rav Amram, what we're talking about is that the original keli that was used to hold the mincha, the original vessel used to hold the mincha, was overflowing. So when you put it back in, you put the komets back in, it was above the rim of the keli, and therefore, since it's not within the hollow area of the keli, it does not become sanctified by the klishares. So Gemara says, hold on. If that's what we're talking about, umekame techi kametz. How can you take a kmitza like that? Remember, we've learned previously a discussion about surface tension. Okay? We had a discussion about surface tension, which is like this much out of the keli. Here you're talking about gedusha. There's a pile on top. It's certainly not inside the keli. So what do you mean? How are you going to take the kmitza? You got to take a kmitza from a carbon mincha, which is inside a keli. You're telling me there's like a ice cream cone amount of mincha over here. So you'll scoop it out from the top. That's a problem in its own right. It's not inside the klishares. Gemara says, no, that couldn't be that was the case. What you did is you returned it to a keli that was full all the way until the top. Okay, so now the Gemara says the kima de kamatzle. Let's think about this. It was full all the way to the top. You do the kmitza, and what happens? Avid leguma. It makes a hole in it. Now it's not full anymore. Now kimahada legave, when you return it back in there, demana kimahada legave demana kamahada. So the Gemara says when you put it back in, it'll go back inside that hole. In other words, it's not going to work. What you're telling me is the keli was full all the way to the top. So now, essentially that answer was, so when you put the komets back in the original keli, it will be above the keli and not within the keli. The Gemara says that that's just not true, because your original mincha was full to the top. You stick your fingers in there to take the komets out, now you'll have a hole. So when you put it back in, guess where your komets is going to go? In that hole, within the keli. So Gemara says, no, that's not what happens. When he returns it, he puts it on like the ledge of this keli. Umanidle, he shakes it. V'nafal memela, and it falls in by itself. It's as if a monkey returned it inside. In other words, the expression of chzirukov is just an expression of some kind of sophisticated way of getting it in there, but which is not human. So in other words, according to this answer, what happened was it was full. He took out the kmitza and he put it back in on the part of the keli which was still full, so it's above, and then he shakes it. He shakes it down, and then it falls in. So that's not considered return to a klisharis because it falls in essentially by itself. A bit of a stretch to say that that was the case that Ben Beseira was talking about, but I guess it can work. Amar le Rav Yomi Rav Zera. Rabbi responded to Zera and said, why don't we just give another way of getting out of this problem? Again, the problem we're getting out of is that according to Ben Beseir, when you put it back inside the keli, it's essentially going to Klisharis, and according to those who say, once it goes into Klisharis, you can't redo it again, how are we going to ever get it back into the original Klisharis? The Gemara says, "V'lukma, why don't we establish this case we're talking about Kagon, Shechzeru lekeli hamunach hagabi karka. You put it back into a keli that was on the ground. In other words, the premise of this is that Kohen needs to be holding the keli for it to be sanctified in the klisharis. So why don't you just say, simple, it was a regular mincha keli, and there was plenty of room in the keli, they put it back inside the keli. What was the problem? It was on the floor as opposed to being in his hand. Amalei, he said to him, Shma mina komtzin mikli, we learn from here that the fact that it's on the floor is not a problem. Now, so again, I think I said an Amar Le, an extra Amar Le. Let's just go Amar Le, Rabbi Yehuda L'Zeh, but look, he was saying, it must be we learn from here, come to Miklisha Gabe Karka, that you're allowed to take a kmitza from a keli that's on the ground, does not have to be held by the Kohen. So now he responded to him. Zera responded to him, he said, Konagat bebaya di'iboilon. You are now, you've touched upon a question that we have been asking for a long time. The Gemara says, Rav Avimi, Tani Menachos Be'er Richter. Rav Avimi was a Talmud of Richter, and when he was learning Menachos, he was learning Rav Chista's yeshiva. Now, the Gemara just stops for a minute on a slight little tangent over here to say, hold on a second. Is it true that Avimi was a Talmud of Rav Chista? And we'll get back to this discussion in a minute. Avimi be Rav Chista. Tani, is it true that Avimi was a Talmud of Rav Chista? That can't be. V'ha'amar Rav Chista. Didn't Rav Chista tell us another time? Kulfi tabai bali me'avimi. I have ultimately absorbed many strikings from Avimi. In other words, he was saying, I went through a tremendous amount of busha learning by Avimi. So you see clearly, in Chista, he learned as a Talmud by Avimi. So how could it be that Avimi was a Talmud of Rav Chista if Rav Chista says, I've gotten many petch from my Rebbe, Avimi? Why did he get patched? And he explains. Allah dahashmaita balahachar zutzufin lamed yom sheni v'chamishi samech yom. Just the background what this is talking about. It's really not our subject today, but the Gemara is talking about a case where in Maseches Erechim or Arachin, where a person passes away and leaves over Yisomim, but he also has people he owes a lot of money to. So what Beis Din will do is they're going to make a sale on his estate, and they're going to take the money of those sales to pay back those people. Now the halacha is they're supposed to advertise these sales for a specific amount of time to make sure customers come buy it. Now, what happened there was that Rav Chista asked a question to Avimi, because it says in one place you do it for 30 days, one place for 60 days. And he responded and said, 30 days is if you do it straight, but 60 days is if you only do it on Mondays and Thursdays. That was the discussion over there. But there was essentially a lot of embarrassment that came along with him asking that question and him getting that answer. So in other words, but the point of this just is to say, now, our Gemara is saying that Avimi learned as a Talmud, as a student, by Rav Chista, where Rav Chista talks about an experience he had learning by Avimi, and where he was very embarrassed. The Gemara says actually something very sad. Avimi mesechta iakra is akrle. Avimi had a terrible misfortune that he forgot an entire mesechta. He didn't know it. Maybe he got older and he didn't remember the Masechta anymore. And it bothered him very much. He went back to his Talmud to relearn it from his Talmud. In other words, he taught it to Rav Chista. Rav Chista was his Talmud. And then never he forgot it. So he went back to his Talmud for his Talmud to learn it. That's why, in other words, it's definitely true that Avimi, I may have just mixed it up. It's definitely true that Avimi was a Talmud of Rav Chista. But Rav Chista also went back to learn from Avimi. Right? Did I mix the whole thing up? I think I mixed the whole thing up. So let's say it again. Rav Chista was the one who forgot the Masechta. No, Avimi. He went to learn it back from his Talmud. Okay, so that's what happened. So now the Gemara wants to know, so this is out of order. Why is the Rebbe coming to his Talmud? The Talmud should have come to his Rebbe to go teach him. The Rebbe calls up his Talmud and says, come teach me something I forgot. The Talmud should say, sure, I'll be right over. I'll come over every morning. Why is he going to the shir of his Talmud? The Gemara says, Savar, he thought, Hachi mistaya milsa tvei, this will work out better. If we look at Rashi, Rashi says something very interesting, Mishum yogati umatzasi. He knew that if he's going to have to get up every single day, go to the base medrash, walk in there, find a seat, sit through the shir with everybody else, he will have worked much harder. The halach is yogati umatzasi tam, and if you work hard on something and ultimately you get to success, you're supposed to believe that. A person doesn't work so hard and he says I was successful, you're not really supposed to believe that. In other words, the idea behind this was he recognized hard work was the key. It was embarrassing for him to go to his Talmud. It was embarrassing for him to have to take a seat among all the rest of the common folk. It was a whole thing to ask questions and to be embarrassed by having to have these questions answered. It was very embarrassing, but he realized all that hard work was worth it, and that's why instead of having his Talmud come to him, he went to his Talmud. Ultimately, now, Paga Bey Rav Nachman. So this all started with, let's just go back to this original line. What happened was we were discussing whether a kmitza can be taken from a keli that's on the floor, and we started this by saying, Rav Vimi Tana Menachos by Rav Richter. Rav Vimi learned Menachos by Rav Richter. Now back. Paga Bey Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman bumped into Avimi. Amarle, he said to him, Ketzad Kompton, how are you supposed to take a kmitza? Simple question. He saw him walking home from shul one day. He said, Rabbi, how do you take a kmitza? Amarle, he said to him, he happened to, what mazel, as he's walking home, he sees this beautiful keli sitting on the floor. He says, Mikliza. You see this keli? Take a kmitza from this keli. Amarle, he said to the Chikomtza Miklisha Gabikarka. Really, Rabbi? Are you allowed to take a kmitza from a keli that's on the floor? Amarle to magbale, pick it up. I didn't mean that it has to be on the floor. I just was pointing out this is an appropriate keli to use. So he asked another question. Ketzad mekachin menachos. How are you supposed to be mekadosh the mincha? In other words, the original mincha. How are you mekadosh it? Amarle, he said to him, no kliza. You could put it into this keli. In other words, everything worked out beautifully. There was this keli on the floor. He asked him, how do you do a kmitza? From that keli. How are you mekadosh it originally? Put it in that keli. He responded and said to him, can you be mekadosh the mincha which is on the floor? Amarle said, yeah, the magbale kohen. You're right, so a kohen has to pick it up. So now he said to him, Amarle, he said to him, in Kain hitzrachta gimel kohanim. According to what we just said, you have to have now 3 kohanim. In other words, you have to have one kohen to hold the keli when you put the mincha in, another kohen to do the kmitza, another kohen to hold the keli that you're going to take the kmitza and put it in. In other words, all of them have to be done with the right hand. So you only have one right hand. So one kohen holds the keli which the mincha is in. Another kohen uses his right hand to take the kmitza out. And another kohen holds the other keli that he puts the kmitza in. So now you're telling me you have to have 3 kohanim in this process. So his response was, Amarle, okay, where's the limit? Why do you feel so limited by the fact you have to have 3 kohanim? It comes to a carpet tamid that they did every single day twice. You have to have 13 kohanim. So big deal. A mincha needs 3 kohanim. Zol Shain Zayin, what's the big deal? So now the Gemara says, Esvei. If it's true you have to have 3 kohanim, let's look at this for a minute. Zaklal, here's the rule. Kol HaKometz, anyone who's part of the mincha process, he takes a kmitza, or venosa mekeli is a person who puts into the keli, hamolach, person who does halacha, v'amakter, person who puts it on his beach. Again, those are the 4 avodas of a mincha. Lechel, davar shtarko lechel. In other words, this is really talking about anybody who's doing the process properly and then he has an inappropriate thought or an improper thought. Now, it never says anywhere in that process, ilu magbiya lo katani. It never mentions anywhere that there's a significant job called picking up the keli. The Gemara says, it's true. It doesn't mention every single job there. Tana, seder avodos nakit. Tana was telling you the critical parts of the avodah that need to be done. However, Velo Seder Kohanim wasn't giving you a count of how many Kohanim are needed to do that. There's an avodah called Kmitza. Now, once you learn the halachas, you might figure out you'll need 3 people to be involved. That's not a big deal. We weren't giving you a count of people who have to do it. We were just giving you account of avodos. They asked the question from Rav Sheshes, what's the halacha? So they asked Rav Sheshes the same question. What's the halacha about taking a kmitza from a keli that's on the ground? Amarle said, Puk chazi my avdon lagav. Let's go see what they do inside the Beis Hamikdash. Now this is not referring to a carbon mincha, but this is referring to the avoda that was done on the shulchan. Now the avoda on the shulchan, just quickly before we see it inside. The shulchan obviously was a table, and it was loaded up with lechem panim, the showbread. Now, in addition to that, there was shnei bazichin, 2 spoons of levona, the frankincense, on the shulchan, which are compared in our Gemara to a kometz. Now let's see how this works. He said to Pukchaz, you take a look. What do you do inside? 4 kohanim walk in or approach the shulchan. Shnayim biyadam beis starim. 2 of them are holding these 2 rows of bread. Each one has 6. V'shnayim biyadam shnei bezichin. 2 of them are holding. Each one's holding these 2 spoons. V'arba mekadm lifneim. 4 go ahead of them. So you have 4, 2 holding the bread, 2 holding the spoons, and then another 4 of arba mekadm lifneim. So you have 8 altogether. Go ahead of them. Shnayim lito shnei starim. 2 of them. Their job is to remove the bread that's on the shulchan, because you can't have a time when the shulchan doesn't have any bread. It's got to go, as you're taking the old bread off on Shabbos, you put the new bread on. So now you have 4 people, shnayim lito shnei starim, 2 of them, each one takes off 1 pile, and then ubeis lito beis bezichin, and 2 of them are taking those 2 spoons. Now, hold on a second, says the Gemara, taking those spoons off of the shulchan is tantamount to doing a kmitza. Doesn't say anywhere that someone picks up the table, the shulchan. You left that part out. Because again, if kmitza is equal to taking the spoons of frankincense off of the shulchan, someone should have to pick up the shulchan, just like someone has to pick up the keli for the kmitza. No, but it doesn't say anywhere that a person picks up the table. Where it says, Lav Amrit, Hasim said the Vodas Nagat. They were talking about what was done. Hachanami said the Vodas Nagat. We're talking about what was done, but we're not counting the amount of people. The Gemara says, no. Midami, Hasam, Lo Nachas Leminyana. When it came to our case of a mincha, we're talking about a kometz, we never counted how many people are involved. We just said, guess what? Someone's got to do a kometz. Now, you have to figure out how many people to put there. But here it says 4 people. 4 plus 4 is 8. And once you're giving a number, if it's really not true, because you have to have another 4 people to pick up the shulchan, so tell me that 12 people went in there. The Kohanim. The Gemara says, you know why it does not say that there were 12 kohanim? Because 4 of them were picking up the shulchan? Because they didn't pick up the shulchan. Shulchan stayed exactly where it was, on the floor, and the 4 kohanim went in. 2 of them removed the bread, 2 of them removed the spoons of frankincense, and the shulchan stayed on the floor. And since the shulchan could stay on the floor when you remove the shnei bazich and the 2 spoons, so the kometz, the keli that's holding the mincha could be on the floor as well. Shema mina, so we learn from here, you do not need to be holding the keli when the kmitza is taken out. Amar Rava. Rava says, pshitali, it's obvious to me, Komtin miklisha al gabe karka, that you're allowed to do kmitza from a keli which is on the floor. Why shekei matzina b'silik bezichin? As we just mentioned, we find that with regard to taking off the spoons of frankincense from the shulchan, and now mekadshin mincha b'klisha al gabe karka. It could also be mekadish the mincha. So there's 2 things: taking the kmitza, and then you're originally placing it to a keli. Mekadshin mincha b'klisha al gabe karka. How do we know that? Shekei matzina, for we find say the bezichin the same thing. They put the spoons of the frankincense onto the shulchan while it was on the floor. By Rava. Now Rava has the following question. In other words, taking a kmitza and putting the mincha to a keli, he says, is obviously could be on the floor. Now he wants to know something else. Kiddush komet mai. What's the halacha with being mekadosh the komets? So again, step 1, putting the mincha into a keli. Step 2, taking the komets out of the keli. Step 3, putting the komets into another keli. That's his question. Kiddush komets mai. Mi mincha yalfinan. We learn that out from a mincha, and just like the other steps of the mincha can be done when the keli is on the floor. Oh, maybe midam yalfinallah. Maybe this is compared to the dam, to the blood of a karban. As we mentioned, putting the kmitza into a keli is exactly the same thing in the process of kabbalas dam. The Kabbalah Stam, the Kohen does have to be holding the keli. The Gemara says, Hadar Pashta. Later on, he figured out the answer to this. He said, Midam Yalfinan La. We do learn it out from blood. He doesn't say where he learned it from, but I guess his understanding was that since the 4 avodos of the carbon mincha are exactly parallel to the 4 avodos of a regular carbon, so then since you have to be holding the keli when you do a Kabbalah Stam, you have to be holding the keli when you put the kamitz into that keli as well. The Gemara says, hold on, is it true that Rava said that you have to be holding the keli when you put the kamitz into it? Well, Itmar, we learned, kometz shechelku b'shnei kelim. If you took a kometz and you divided it into 2 kelim. Rav Nachman says, Eino kadosh. You take a kometz, you put it into 2 kelim, it's not going to work. You have to put the entire kometz into 1 keli. Rava says, kadosh. It is kadosh. Now, the im isa, if it's true that we learn it from blood, leilif midam, we should learn it from blood, and it should not work. In other words, you got to have both sides of the coin. If you're telling me that you need to be holding it because you learn it from blood, so then when Rava tells me that you're allowed to go ahead and put the kometz into 2 separate kelim, that shouldn't be true either. Because when it comes to a carbon, you have to catch all the blood in 1 keli. You can't have a tiny bit of blood in each keli. That has to be enough to sprinkle the blood in each keli. So it has to be exactly equal. So the Gemara says, how to be Rava Meir, he backed off of that. Now the Gemara wants to know, how do you know when it comes to blood that you can't catch it in several different kelim? How do you know that it has to be that you catch all the blood in 1 keli, or all the blood that you're going to use for the zrika in 1 keli? The Tani of Tachlifa ben Shaul, where it says, I know it from the following from Tachlifa ben Shaul. It says, Kidesh pachos mikdei azah b'klizeh. If you were mekadesh, you sanctified or caught less than the amount of blood that's required for sprinkling on the Mizbeach in 1 keli, upachos mikdei azah b'klizeh, and less than the required amount for azah in this keli, lo kidesh. It doesn't work. And we ask the following question. Bedam mai. So again, I'm sorry, this is true. I mixed it up. This is not talking about dam of a carbon. This is talking about the mechatas. Mechatas, which has to be sprinkled from the paraduma, you have to get it all, you have to put it all into 1 keli. Now the Gemara wants to know, do we compare the mechatas to dam? Bedam mai. What's the luck when it comes to dam? Do we say hilchasahi? Well, by para aduma, it's halacha mosh misinai. You can't start learning from halacha mosh misinai to other cases. Odilma, maybe perhaps hasam my taima. What's the reason why you have to have all the mechatas in 1 keli? The chsiv, it says v'taval ba'mayim. You will dip your finger into mayim, and it says with a pasach v'taval ba'mayim. Hachanami haksiv v'taval ba'adam. In other words, why is it you have to have all the required water of mechatas to be in 1 keli? Because it says ba'mayim. So if that's true, you don't need to have a limud to learn from mechatas to dam. You could just say the same source that tells me all the water has to go in the keli will tell me all the blood has to go into the keli. What's that source? It says ba'mayim, it says badam. V'itmar, we learned upon the Amar of Zrika, Amar Rabbi Lazar, af badam lo kidesh. He ultimately said, yes, it's true. Just like it says ba'mayim, it says badam, and therefore you would have to have all of the blood in 1 keli. And therefore, yellow kiddush. Amar Rava, Tani Namiach. We have a brayso that says the same thing. This is B'fnei Kohen Mashiach. B'taval, it says that you'll dip the Kohen will dip his finger in v'lo misapig, and not that he will like scrape up. In other words, you have to be able to dip your finger into enough water that it's a dipping. You can't just rub your finger on the side to scrape it off or sponge it up. Why shehei b'dam shir tvila? This teaches us that the blood has to have a shir tvila. Again, telling us that whenever you're going to catch the blood or put the blood in the keli, there has to be enough blood in there for you to dip your finger in, and you can't divide that into a bunch of different keli. Min adam. Again, the word b'taval tells you have to be able to do a real dipping, and min hadam, the pasuk says min adam shebe'inyin. I think I skipped a line. V'taval v'loy misapig. Bidam, when it says bidam, shehei bidam shir tvila meikar, you have to have the required amount of blood all the way from the beginning. In other words, even if you'll later pour more blood in, that's not enough. You have to have, again, let's go through the three halachas because I think I've just mixed it up myself. V'taval, the word v'taval says, v'lo masapa, you have to actually dip your finger into enough blood that there's a dipping. Bidam, when it says in the pasuk, or badam, shehei badam shir tvila meikaro. You have to have that when you originally put the blood in that keli, there was enough for a significant tvila and a zrika. Then it says, min adam, Shabin, the pasuk says, Min Adam has to be the blood of the issue. I'm not going to translate that now, just because the Gemara is going to explain it in just a minute. You have to write all of this. You have to write Yitzchak Michtav V'taval. You have to write the word V'taval. Yitzchak Michtav V'dam. You also have to write the word V'dam. Why? If the pasuk only said V'taval, I would think Havi Amina Afagav Lo Kibel Shir Tvilos. In other words, I would say even if it doesn't have the required amount, and here we have one of these parentheses again, which is like serving as a Rashi function, which is the Hainuz Hazaz Ayin Pa'amim, has to be enough for the 7 sprinklings. May Karai all the way from the beginning. Because Rachmana, Badam, no, it's got to be the full shear. Because Rachmana Badam, if it only said the word Badam, have a minute, I would have thought, I feel a maspig, even if he's just going to scrape his finger and get enough blood, so because Rachmana V'tavam and Adam, there has to be no, you got to be enough blood for all the sprinklings and a full-fledged dipping, not scraping along the side. Now the Gemara wants to know, what does this mean, dam sheba inyan? What's this? It has to be the blood of that issue. So when this comes to tell you that when you dip your finger in to do a sprinkling of the blood, what's left over after you sprinkle it, that blood now is disqualified. You cannot do a second sprinkling with that dam. Now, this is ultimately a raya. Rabbi Lazar, the leftover blood on your finger is disqualified. So, Amalei Ravin, Barav Ado L'Rava, Amri Tamidach. Your Tamidim said that Amar Rav Amram Tanya. We learned in the Rabbi Sahaya Mazah, he was sprinkling V'nitzeh Hazah Miyado. This is referring to the halacha we learned in Perek Dam Chatas that if there's any blood that gets onto a Kohen's clothing, they have to do a special type of washing to wash it off. Now, what blood is the kind of blood that requires this type of washing? It's only blood that's qualified for zrika. So now let's learn this inside. It says, Tanya Hayamazda, he was doing zrika, binit zehazda amiyado, a little bit of blood sprinkled off from his hand. Now it says, im ad shalohiza, if it got into his clothing before he sprinkled it. So in other words, that blood essentially is blood which can still be used. Ton kibos. You have to wash the clothing. Mishahiza, but once you've already done the sprinkling, ein ton kibus, you do not need to go ahead and wash off those clothing. Why? Because that blood's already disqualified, it was used. My love, what does this mean? Ad shalo gamar haza also. It sounds like up until you finish. So in other words, all blood up until you finish, the final sprinkling is going to be qualified and would require this type of kibbutz, this type of washing. Umisha gamar also, once you finish the final sprinkling, at that point in time, it's not going to require kibbutz. So this sounds like even leftover blood on the finger between sprinkles is going to be qualified to be used. It's only when you're finally done the last one that's going to be disqualified. The Gemara says, no, we see from here that the leftover blood on your finger is kosher because it seems like if that blood were to get onto your clothing, you'd have to do this kibbutz, this washing. Nora says, no. Lo, achlo yatsasa miyado hazah ton kibus. If the blood on your finger got on your clothing before you sprinkled it, that's when you have to wash it. However, umishi yatsasa hazah miyado. Once that sprinkling left your finger and went onto the mizbeach, at that point in time, whatever's left on your finger, v'nitzeh mimasha nishar ein ton kibus. If your clothing got dirty from blood that was left on your finger after the sprinkling, it does not need kibus. Why? Because at that point in time, it's considered to be shirayim. Now, Baya has a kash on this. It says, Gamar milahazos, when he finishes sprinkling, this is talking about the blood of the paraduma, mekaneach yado, he takes his hand and wipes his hand, begufa shel para, on the body of the para. In other words, we want him to burn everything. So he sprinkles the blood. He stands on top of Har Mishkan and he sprinkles the blood. When he finishes with that, he goes down to the bottom of the mountain and he wipes his hands on the animal of the paraduma, and they burn the whole thing. The point is to burn all that leftover blood. Now, Gamar, it says when he Gamar lahazos, that's when he has to go ahead and wipe his hands on the paraduma. Lo Gamar, if he does not do that, does not finish sprinkling it, does not have to wipe his hands. So it sounds like you just put your finger in, sprinkle, put your finger in, sprinkle, put your finger in, sprinkle. Now, the problem is if there's leftover blood in your finger and that blood is disqualified, you'd have to wipe it off each time before you do the next sprinkling. Amarle said to him, no, Gamar, when you finish Mekanach Yada, that's when he has to wipe his whole hand. Lo Gamar, if he doesn't finish, Mekanach Etzba'o. He just wipes off that finger. So of course he has to wipe off his finger between each one because the leftover blood is disqualified. He does not have to wipe his whole hand on the para. Now the Gemara says, just practically, Bishlam Gamar, when he finishes Mekanach Yada Begufo Shapara, he walks all the way down the mountain and then he wipes his hands on the guf, on the body of the paraduma, the chsiv, the saraf as sapar le'eno, you have to burn the power with everything in it. Aval elalo gamar, if he did not finish kanech with etzbo, b'may mekanech. Where's he supposed to wipe his finger? You're going to make him take a hike all the way down the mountain between each sprinkling? This should have taken 5 minutes. Sprinkle, dip, sprinkle, dip, sprinkle, dip, sprinkle. Now you're making him go for a 3-hour walk all the way down the mountain each time to wipe his finger. That's a bit much. Skip the parentheses. Rabbi bisfas mizrak. He will ultimately wipe his finger on the edge of the mizrak on the outside. The ksiv kipurei zav. That mizrak was referred to as kipurei zav. We do find that sometimes kippur also refers to a cleaning. So ultimately, what comes out of here is that the leftover blood on his finger after each sprinkling is disqualified. What does he do with it? He has to wipe it off, and he wipes it on the outside of the keli. How did we get into this whole discussion about the leftover blood? Because we start off with this discussion about a mincha, whether you could put into a keli that was put on the floor, right? And Rava, he answered that you learn it out. Again, remember the kasha at the top of the Amad was by Rava Kiddush Kamas Mai. They said and then we were learning about all the halachas of dam, so that we got into all these drashas about how we know the halacha of dam, v'taval and badam, how much dam you have to have in there. Ultimately, the bottom line was that it had to be that there's enough dam inside it originally. Then we went on to this question over here of, We had the kasha of mi amar ravahachi va'amar va'itmar komet shechilki b'shnei kelim, and Nachman said it's not kadosh. Rava said it is kadosh. Remisa leiluf midam. Ultimately, the Gemara said he backed off of that, but the Gemara just wanted to know where he knew this from. In other words, the Gemara wanted to say that if you're going to learn that putting the kmitza into a keli is the same thing as Kabbalah's dam, you should bring all those halachas together. And then we got into a little bit of a discussion about the halachas of Kabbalah's dam in 2 kelim. So we'll stop here for today. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your week. Have a great day, Chavra, on Zoom.